Looking back at my childhood, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was one of the things I was into the most. Until around the mid-90s, I couldn't get enough of these green superheroes. The show, the movies, the toys, and the video games were all amazing, and I loved getting my hands on everything I could. I still have a massive collection of Ninja Turtle games and action figures today. Between 1989 and 2005, Konami released 17 different Ninja Turtle games across a multitude of consoles. In later years, Ubisoft and Activision would take a crack at making Ninja Turtle games. However, for most of us, when we think of Ninja Turtle games, we think of Konami. Sit back, grab a pizza, and join me as we take a look at every single Ninja Turtle game released on a console by Konami. The first Ninja Turtle game was released in 1989 and was simply called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. The game was originally released for the NES but was ported to almost every computer format the year after in 1990. The game is a side-scroller that has some unique features to it. Despite the cover of this game saying it was made by Ultra Games, this game was actually made by Konami. Ultra Games was a shell company that only existed for Konami to get around the Nintendo of America's 5-game-a-year rule. The game doesn't have a live system, but rather allows you to switch between the 4 turtles, who each have their own health bars. Each of the turtles also have unique attacks based on which weapon they use, making some of the turtles drastically better than the other turtles. For instance, Raphael is pretty much worthless because his range is so short, and he's usually just a throwaway turtle, while Donatello has the longest range and should only be used when necessary. This adds a bit of strategy to how you play this side-scroller. As seen in the 5th episode of The Angry Video Game Nerd, this game isn't great. It's incredibly difficult, glitchy, and it controls poorly. Jumping can be a major pain because you'll either go into somewhat of a normal jump, or your jump will go into a flip. The handling of both jumps feels weird and sort of out of control. The way enemies spawn in this game can be a nuisance because every time they leave the screen, it'll respawn immediately. The bane of this game is the underwater level after the dam level. This is pretty early on in the game, and it is a major roadblock for many gamers. The level is timed, and you have to defuse bombs throughout an underwater maze, and this wouldn't be so bad if there weren't for the seaweed in this level. Touching the seaweed causes you damage, and there's a corridor in the middle of the level that's nearly impossible to pass through without taking a ton of damage. Without the use of Game Genie, I think I've only passed this part of the game maybe twice in my life. The one thing that stands out the most with the original Ninja Turtle game is the soundtrack. Most of the tracks are classic, with the overworld theme being one of my favorite chiptune tracks of all time. There's nothing like throwing on a few of the original Ninja Turtle tracks to take me back. Overall, the original Ninja Turtle game isn't great. It has a lot of issues, however it is a unique entry into the NES's side-scroller genre. It's worth playing through just to see how hard an NES game can be and kinda how bad it can control. In the same year, in 1989, the arcade version of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was released. This game was a beat-em-up and was pretty awesome in the arcade. The game featured 4-player simultaneous gameplay and was one of my favorite arcade games as a kid. I must have dumped a ton of quarters into it. I was extremely happy in 1990 when an NES port of the arcade game was released. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game, was a majorly scaled-down port of the arcade beat-em-up. When the game came out, I was extremely excited to play the arcade class without having to dump a ton of quarters into the machine to keep going. Playing through the game today, however, is a fairly one-dimensional beat-em-up, and it doesn't really hold up. Each turtle has pretty much the same attack range, which makes each of the turtles feel way too similar. The only difference between each of the turtles is the color they are and the slight animation they'll have with their weapon. The game is a fairly standard beat-em-up, but other than jumping and attacking, you have no other abilities. The game throws wave after wave of enemies at you, and eventually it becomes tedious and boring. The levels are fairly short despite having to take a long time to beat due to the number of enemies they throw at you. The main thing that makes this game tedious is it being based on an arcade game. Many beat-em-ups on the arcades were designed to generate revenue rather than being a good experience to play from home. This causes the game to have way too many enemies to whittle away at your quarters in the arcade, but doesn't provide a quality home experience. Don't get me wrong though, this game was amazing at the time. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 is a nostalgia game to play, and while amazing at the time, it hasn't aged well. Most modern gamers would be better off playing almost any other beat-em-up unless you can find an actual arcade cabinet of the game. Also in 1990, the first Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle title would be released for the Game Boy called Fall of the Foot Clan. As with many Game Boy games, it's fairly short and surprisingly playable. The entire game is beatable within around 25 minutes, and it's super easy, but it is a fun romp as the Turtles. The game is a side-scroller where you vanquish waves of foot soldiers. Pretty much every enemy in the game other than bosses can be killed in one shot, so you're just kinda rampaging through the levels with nothing that can stand up to you. The bosses are fairly easy as well, however offer just enough challenge to make them exciting to beat. Fall of the Foot Clan really doesn't stand out, but it is fun to hear the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle theme on the Game Boy sound chip. The The game is super easy and offers a fairly decent Ninja Turtles experience on the go, however, it really doesn't compare to any of the home console games. In 1991, there wasn't many Ninja Turtle games released for the consoles, probably because Konami was working on a slew of Ninja Turtle titles that would be released in 1992. The only Ninja Turtle game released was a Game Boy game called TMNT 2, Back from the Sewers. The game is similar to the original Game Boy title, with more cartoony-looking Ninja Turtle sprites. Personally, I like the look of the original Game Boy game a little bit better. Back from the Sewers does mix it up slightly with a few beat-em-up style levels where you can move up and down rather than just being stuck to a 2D plane. The game is far more challenging than the original game, however, still isn't very hard. The boss's difficulty when comparing it to the original are ramped up and provide a pretty decent challenge. Overall, Back from the Sewers has some nice updates to the original Game Boy game's formula. However, graphically it's a step back because the Ninja Turtles look so dopey in this game. It's nothing really to write home about, but it is a decent Game Boy title. In 1992, a trio of Ninja Turtle games were released for the three most major consoles at the time: the NES, the SNES, and the Sega Genesis. The first title of the three games released in 1992 was an NES game called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3: The Manhattan Project. The game was extremely similar to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game for the NES, however it had one major feature added in. The game had a special attack ability that was performed by pressing A and B at the same time. Using the special attack takes health when you use it, and the attack varies between each of the turtles. This breaks the problem that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game, had, by having no differences between the turtles, because now there are actually major variations between the turtles' special moves. This game featured more of a plot than the previous games by having Manhattan scooped up and carried away as a floating island by Shredder and Krang. It's up to the turtles to stop Shredder and return Manhattan to its rightful place in New York City. The music in this game stands out with some really laid-back NES chiptunes on this game. The environments are also far more varied and far more enjoyable than the endless street scenes of its precursor. It's packed with plenty of water and palm trees and feels like a nice vacation from the streets and confined buildings of the previous title. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3: The Manhattan Project is probably the best Ninja Turtle title on the NES. While at times it still feels like a mindless beat-em-up, it's far more geared for the home market rather than the arcade market, making it far superior to its predecessor. The Ninja Turtles series of games finally made its leap into the 16-bit era in August of 1992 when both the Hyperstone Heist for the Sega Genesis and Turtles in Time for the Super Nintendo were released. Both of these games, while looking similar, are quite different. Both of the games featured the attack, jump, special button command layout established in the Manhattan Project, and look amazing in their 16-bit glory. Both of the 16-bit versions of the series also feature the ability to ram enemies by running at them, which further deepens the gameplay of this beat-em-up series. The Hyperstone Heist for the Sega Genesis has a similar plotline to the Manhattan Project. However, instead of having the city turn into a floating island, the city is shrunk, and again the turtles have to save New York. The Hyperstone Heist is leaps and bounds ahead of its 16-bit counterparts graphically, however, gameplay-wise, it recycles quite a bit from previous games. Elements of the levels in this game are amazingly similar to previous Ninja Turtle titles. Both the Manhattan Project and Hyperstone Heist have similar levels taking place on hoverboards on the ocean. The Baxter Stockman boss fight in Hyperstone Heist is also identical to the same boss fight in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game. Hyperstone Heist combines elements from all the Ninja Turtle games released previously, and it is an acceptable first entry to the series for the Sega Genesis. However, if you've played the previous Ninja Turtle titles, you can get the feeling that you've played many of these levels before. You could almost consider this as one of the earliest HD remix-style games ever produced, only instead of HD, it's 16-bit. The Super Nintendo version of the 1992 trio was a port of the Turtles in Time arcade game released a year prior. In terms of arcade games, this is a direct sequel to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles the arcade game, however on consoles, it's considered to be the fourth of the series. In each of the three Ninja Turtle games released in 1992, something bad happens to New York City. In this version, the Statue of Liberty gets stolen. Turtles in Time finally feels like the series found the perfect balance between arcade-style beat-em-ups and a difficulty that's appropriate for the home market. Never in this game does it feel like there's too many waves of enemies, or that the enemies are taking too many hits to kill. While in the Sega version, it feels more like an updated version of the classic beat-em-up Turtle games for the NES, this game really feels like it's been updated to a truly 16-bit experience. Turtles in Time features some of the coolest levels of any Ninja Turtle game. The premise of the game is that you're being thrown through time and you'll visit several time periods. This gave the game's creators quite a bit of room to really do whatever they wanted to. The game takes you from the age of the dinosaurs to the not-too-distant future. The bosses also look like the time period you're in, and seeing Bebop and Rocksteady in pirate outfits is pretty cool. The game features several enjoyable bonus levels as well as some of the most interesting boss fights ever seen in a beat-em-up style game. The first time you fight Shredder, the game has you throwing members of the Foot Clan at the machine that Shredder's in. The coolest part of the whole thing is that you're seeing the entire battle from Shredder's perspective. Turtles in Time sets the bar for all beat-em-ups released after it, and really holds up as one of the strongest entries to the genre today. In 1993, several Ninja Turtle games were released, the third installment to the Game Boy series, as well as 3 fighting games called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighters. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 Radical Rescue for the Game Boy was a massive change from the previous 2 installments for the Game Boy. The game has you playing as Michelangelo, and you have to rescue the other 3 turtles. You're able to free roam over a massive map, choosing your own path. As you find the other turtles captive, you're able to open up more of the map, making this an early example of a Metroidvania game. The difficulty is drastically increased compared to the previous titles in the series, which unfortunately makes it hard to get anywhere. The premise of this game is a good idea, but the difficulty makes it hard to see much of the game because the map is just so big, and whenever you die it starts you at the beginning again. This isn't a bad game, but it's hard to see much of it due to the difficulty. The 3 different Ninja Turtle fighting games released in 1993 were released for the NES, SNES, and Sega Genesis. Like many games of the time, despite having the same name, each of these games was completely different from each other. These games came out the same year as Mortal Kombat 2 and were released right in the middle of the fighting game craze of the early 90s. The NES version of Tournament Fighters was actually Konami's final game released for the NES console in North America. The game actually handles pretty good as a fighting game despite only having 2 buttons. The roster of fighters is small but has most of the staples you'd expect. All 4 turtles, Shredder, Casey Jones, as well as a weird character named Hothead, which is from the comic series. If the game had been released 3 or 4 years prior to 1993, it may have been considered one of the most classic NES games. Today, the NES version of Tournament Fighters is one of the most sought-after games for the NES, fetching around $75 a copy. This game's pretty good, but it's not worth it at that high of a price, especially when the Super Nintendo version is superior in almost every way, and is only worth about $13. The Super Nintendo version of Tournament Fighters is a pretty standard 16-bit fighting game. The game borrows heavily from Street Fighter and feels extremely similar to Street Fighter 2. The graphics in this version really pop with bright, colorful sprites and interesting environments to fight in. One of the strangest things about this version of Tournament Fighters was the roster of fighters Konami chose to go with. Almost none of the characters on the roster are from the cartoon or movie series. Instead, the game focuses more on the characters from the Archie comic series of Ninja Turtles. The game also features an original character called Asuka. With such a rich pool of characters to pull from, I have no idea why they chose some of these characters that they put in this game. Where's Bebop? Where's Rocksteady? Why is Rat King and Kawrai the final bosses in the game, and not Krang and Shredder? The Super Nintendo version of Tournament Fighters also has an extremely hard AI. I wouldn't say I'm great at fighting games, but I can usually muddle my way through. But not here. The AI in this game is unrelenting in its brutality. Overall, the Super Nintendo version of Tournament Fighters is fun to play with friends, but is frustrating to play with the AI. The Sega Genesis version of Tournament Fighters is easily the worst. Each attack does so much damage that the fights are over super short, and again, the AI is unrelenting and unfair, even more so than the other versions. This is made worse by the game's stiff and horrible controls. Jumping forward might be one of the hardest things to do in this game because the game won't recognize what you're doing most of the time, and will just have you jumping in place. The roster is small, and it doesn't even have Shredder. Instead, April O'Neil is fighting in the tournament, as well as a character from the Archie comics called Ray Fillet, as well as an original character named Sisyphus who is a walking beetle. All the levels take place on planets with stereotypical themes. Again, where are the main characters from the Ninja Turtle series? Why are there original characters in this game? The Genesis version of Tournament Fighters ranks high on the list of worst fighting games I've ever played. There's almost no redeeming features of this game, and I can't recommend it to anyone. From 1994 through 2002, the Ninja Turtle series had no games released after the original animated series concluded in 1996. The series tried to reboot itself in 1997 with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: The Next Mutation, which was a live-action series created by the company that created Power Rangers. The series, however, was cancelled a year later in 1998 and was met with mostly negative reviews. In 2003, a new Ninja Turtle series was introduced which attempted to follow the original comic book series more closely. With the new series came a slew of new Ninja Turtle-related games. 2 different Ninja Turtle games released in 2003, both with the same name, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Since the 2 games feature the same name as the original game, these are often referred to as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2003. The home console version of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2003 was a simple beat-em-up. The game had some wonky camera angles, and the game could be tedious, taking out all the enemies in each area. The game had to have a radar in the bottom right corner because the camera angles were so bad sometimes you couldn't find the enemies. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2003 does have a pretty cool look to it with cel-shaded graphics, however most of the environments are fairly bland and look repetitive. Overall, this game is largely forgettable and lacks the charm of the 16-bit and 8-bit versions. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2003 for the Game Boy Advance, however, was quite good. The game was a 2D beat-em-up where each of the 4 turtles had their own set of 4 levels, as well as a minigame. Each of the level sets usually had some unique aspects for each turtle. For instance, Raphael can climb walls using his size. The minigames will have you riding on a vehicle while collecting points, and they're usually easy, but a lot of fun. There are some frustrating platforming parts to the game that causes a major hiccup in the game's gameplay. I wouldn't say this game is better than the 16-bit beat-em-up Ninja Turtle games, but this handheld game is definitely stronger than its home console counterpart from the same year. The next year, in 2004, the Ninja Turtles were back with another home console and handheld release. Both games were titled Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 Battle Nexus. The home console version feels like they tried to address many of the criticisms from the 2003 release, however, quite a few new problems cropped up with this one. The camera in this game has become a total nightmare. It moves erratically and rarely shows you what you want to see. They also got rid of the radar, so sometimes finding where the enemies are can be quite a pain. The game has the same repetitive beat-em-up combat from the previous game, however is slightly less repetitive, making it a little more tolerable. There are several parts that break up the repetitive beat-em-up parts of this game, where there are some fairly difficult platforming. It's pretty bad, and pretty much is made worse due to the erratic camera. These parts can be really frustrating and don't feel rewarding at all. Overall, Battle Nexus is a little more playable than Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2003, but is plagued with horrible camera angles. The Game Boy Advance version of Battle Nexus, however, is god-awful. The story mode on the Game Boy Advance is nearly unplayable. On each level you start out without your weapon and are completely defenseless. It's difficult to figure out where you're supposed to go, and everything just feels like a dead end. There's another mode on the Game Boy version of Battle Nexus called Race Mode, and it's kinda like Uniracers, except it's Ninja Turtles on hoverboards. By pressing down on certain colors, you'll be able to speed up, while other colors will damage you and have you fall over them. This mode actually isn't half bad, making Battle Nexus on the Game Boy not a total loss. In 2005, Konami released its final 2 Ninja Turtle games, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 Mutant Nightmare and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Melee. Mutant Melee was released on March 15th of 2005 and was the first of the 2 games released in 2005. The game is a spin-off with fighting matches as well as mini-games. The game is somewhat similar to Super Smash Bros., except it's in a 3D arena. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 Mutant Nightmare was released later in 2005 on November 1st. The game finally corrects many of the issues from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2003 and Battle Nexus, however is a bit repetitive on the beat-em-up sections. The game adds a few shooter-type levels and a hover bike level that break up the monotony of the beat-em-up stages. One of the coolest additions to this game is having all 4 turtles on screen at the same time controlled by the AI. This doesn't really add much in terms of gameplay, but it looks really cool to have the whole team on the screen at the same time. This also is the first 3D Ninja Turtle game that doesn't have invisible walls that can't be passed unless you defeat all the enemies in the area. You can simply run through areas in this game, skipping all of the enemies if you want. One of the strangest things about Mutant Nightmare is that all the enemies are human-like Triceratopses called Triceratons. I had never seen these characters before, so at first I thought the 2003 series must have gotten really weird, but turns out they were in the original series as well as the comic book. They just added them after I stopped watching as a kid. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 Mutant Nightmare overall is the best of the 3D Ninja Turtle beat-em-up games. It adds quite a bit, however it still pales in comparison to its 16-bit counterparts. Mutant Nightmare brings quite a bit to the table with its fun non-beat-em-up levels, and having all 4 turtles on the screen at the same time makes the beat-em-up levels feel cooler and look cooler than they did previously. After 2005, Konami completely pulled out of making Ninja Turtle games, unsurprisingly after how mediocre their releases were after 2003. The series really peaked in terms of beat-em-ups in 1992 with the Manhattan Project, Turtles in Time, and the Hyperstone Heist. Comparing all the games, Turtles in Time for the Super Nintendo was the best Ninja Turtle game Konami ever released. It finds the perfect balance between a home console game and the action of an arcade-style beat-em-up. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 for the Game Boy Advance ends up being the worst Ninja Turtle game, released with a confusing story mode that's pretty much unplayable. Konami released 17 Ninja Turtle games over the course of 16 years. Most of the games are fairly repetitive beat-em-ups, however a few of the games really shine as gems in the beat-em-up genre. The games have seen a huge evolution from the original side-scrolling game into one of the most iconic retro game series. Unfortunately, the series didn't translate well into the 3D era, eventually driving the series into the ground. While not all the games in the series are great, most are memorable, each in their own way.